"Oh, you really thought I was just a regular guy, didn't you?" Emily's laugh echoed across the crowded room, sharp and deliberate, a blade disguised as amusement. The chandelier lights above us glinted against the polished wine glasses, catching in the ripples of champagne as she gestured toward me, her words dripping with mockery. I stood there in my navy blazer, hands relaxed at my sides, feeling the weight of every eye on me, every subtle smirk and whispered comment, and yet I didn't flinch. At first glance, I was just the ordinary man in the room, the one who spent his days in a cubicle at a consulting firm, the one whose weekend projects involved mowing the lawn and fixing the garage door. I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, the little spark she believed gave her control, and I let her think it was working. The crowd laughed again, a ripple of validation for her performance, and I noticed Chad, standing nearby with that self-satisfied grin, thinking he had the upper hand, as if he were part of some untouchable league I could never join. My lips curved into a faint, unassuming smile, as if the jest had not touched me at all, but inside, my mind was already mapping the evening, replaying every glance, every word, every flicker of emotion I'd seen in Emily over the past weeks. There was a rhythm to it, almost like a dance, the way she moved, the cadence of her laughter, the way she positioned herself as the center of attention. I watched without a single outward sign of distress, letting the noise and mockery wash over me, storing every detail like a ledger in my head. Flashbacks drifted in unbidden, the quiet Saturday mornings with her in the kitchen, the small gestures of affection that once seemed monumental, the shared laughter in the park under the warm sun, the evenings where the two of us felt like we were the only people in the world. All of it contrasted sharply with this spectacle, this performance that made me appear so inconsequential in my own life. And yet, I kept my stance, my calm surface hiding the storm underneath, the simmering calculations and the quiet resolve that would not be undone by her display. I reminded myself of the countless nights spent alone, thinking, planning, preparing, and quietly building a life that no one could see yet, a foundation so solid it would one day become undeniable. The glasses clinked, the laughter swelled, and Emily continued, unaware of the shift behind my calm exterior, unaware that the ordinary man in the room had quietly begun the countdown to a revelation that would leave everyone stunned. My heartbeat was steady, controlled, each pulse a metronome counting down to the moment I would finally let the truth surface, the truth that had been hidden beneath years of diligence, foresight, and patience, the truth that no mockery could diminish, no laughter could erase. I sipped my water slowly, feeling the cool glass in my hand, letting the ambient noise form a curtain around the anticipation I was building, letting every smirk and sneer only sharpen the edge of the story that was about to unfold. And in that moment, standing in the midst of her triumph, I felt an almost imperceptible thrill, the quiet, unspoken power of knowing what was to come, knowing that the ordinary image she had of me was about to be shattered, that the man she had ridiculed was not only capable of standing tall, but of revealing a fortune that would leave them all speechless and reordering their perception of everything they thought they knew about me. Mark stepped back slightly, letting the laughter and chatter of the room fill the space between him and Emily, each note a subtle reminder of the gap that had grown over the years. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, the crisp white fabric catching the soft glow of the overhead lights, and allowed himself a deep inhale, the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers grounding him in the present moment. The crowd continued to react to Emily's performance, oblivious to the quiet calculations behind his calm eyes, each smile and tilt of her head catalogued and filed away. He remembered the early mornings spent at the office, the hours building a foundation no one could see, and the evenings at home quietly strategizing, planning, and preparing for the future, the kind of preparation that demanded patience and restraint. The faint clinking of cutlery against plates from the nearby dinner tables reminded him of the many shared meals where laughter had been genuine, not performative, the simple conversations that had once built trust and connection, now replaced by staged mockery. Mark let his gaze wander for a moment, noting the subtle gestures of those around him, the slight nods, the whispered comments that revealed their perceptions and assumptions, all pieces of the puzzle he had been quietly assembling. There was a rhythm to the evening, the ebb and flow of attention, the way voices rose and fell, the delicate balance between amusement and tension, and he recognized that his silence carried its own weight, an invisible assertion of control that contrasted with Emily's loud display. A flash of memory surfaced, him meticulously reviewing financial documents, double-checking accounts, ensuring that every detail was accurate, every contingency considered, the kind of diligence invisible to anyone except himself. That hidden layer of preparation, the careful construction of security and leverage, was the engine powering the twist that would soon unfold, a twist that would not only change perceptions, but shift the balance of power entirely. Mark felt a quiet surge of confidence, the kind that comes from knowing the depth of one's own preparation, the knowledge that patience and foresight could outweigh brashness and mockery. He observed Emily again, noting the slight relaxation in her posture, the confidence she assumed as natural, and allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to cross his face, a signal to himself more than to anyone else, the acknowledgement of the unseen advantage he held. The murmurs around the room continued, a background hum that underscored the performance of social interaction, yet Mark remained detached, fully present in his own awareness, the calm surface belying the anticipation that simmered beneath. He adjusted his tie, a subtle gesture, and let his eyes drift toward the window where the city lights blurred in the distance, a reminder of all the hours of work and planning that had led to this night, each one a silent investment in the moment yet to come. The evening's conversation shifted slightly, a comment here, a question there, and Mark noted each one, each word a signal, a piece of information to be used later, the careful observation of social dynamics, a skill honed over years. In that moment, amidst laughter and light, Mark felt a steady pulse of determination, the quiet power of patience and preparedness coursing through him, knowing that the true measure of influence was not in loud declarations but in the deliberate, controlled unveiling of what had always been there, unseen and underestimated by all. Mark felt the subtle shift in the room as Emily continued to charm the crowd, her laughter floating like a carefully composed melody that masked the tension underneath. He sipped his water, the glass cool against his palm, and allowed his eyes to drift to the small details around him. The way the silverware caught the light, the polished wood of the banister, the subtle fragrance of fresh flowers arranged meticulously along the tables. Every element seemed ordinary to the onlookers, yet to Mark, it was a stage set for observation, every movement, every gesture catalogued in precise mental notes. He recalled the countless evenings spent reviewing financial statements and property deeds, ensuring that every asset and account was accounted for, every contingency planned for, the kind of preparation invisible to anyone who had only ever seen the surface. The laughter at Emily's performance swelled and receded, a tide to which he paid no outward attention, yet each wave carried information, tone, timing, expression, that he stored methodically. Chad moved closer, leaning into the conversation with that familiar smirk, believing himself to be in a position of superiority, and Mark allowed the moment to pass, unreactive, letting the assumptions of others settle around him like dust. Memories surfaced of earlier times with Emily, quiet dinners at home, walks in the park, conversations that were genuine, not performative, and he felt the contrast keenly, the difference between authentic connection and the artificial show she displayed now. He reminded himself that patience and calm were his allies, that the power of foresight was far stronger than the fleeting thrill of mockery. Observing Emily, he noted the little cues, shift of weight, fleeting glances, micro-expressions that hinted at confidence, but also slight uncertainty, and he cataloged each silently, the awareness sharpening his anticipation. The background hum of conversation, the gentle clinking of glasses, the occasional soft laughter, all formed a tapestry that Mark could read, each thread a signal to his next step. He imagined the reaction when the unseen would be revealed, when the quiet diligence of years would surface and alter every perception in the room. The knowledge of his hidden assets, the careful management of investments and accounts, the meticulous record-keeping that had gone unnoticed, all provided a foundation upon which he would construct the coming revelation. A subtle, controlled smile played on his lips, one that conveyed nothing to the room but reinforced to himself the certainty that the evening would not end as it appeared to, that the ordinary man they saw had been underestimated, and that every laugh, every jest, every confident smirk directed at him would soon be reframed by the truth that lay beneath, quietly amassed and patiently held. The evening wore on, and the laughter around the room became a background rhythm, almost hypnotic, as Mark observed the subtle dynamics playing out before him. Emily continued to hold center stage, her gestures smooth and practiced, yet to Mark, there was a pattern in the performance, a sequence of attention and distraction that revealed as much as it concealed. He traced the glint of the chandelier lights across the polished surfaces, the reflections in the crystal glasses, the careful positioning of napkins and plates, noting how these details framed the social scene and highlighted the illusions everyone accepted as reality. The faint murmur of conversation in the corner of the room provided another layer of information, each phrase, each laugh, each tone carefully logged in Mark's mind, an invisible ledger of interactions and hierarchies. He recalled the hours spent quietly organizing his own affairs, the meticulous attention to financial accounts, investments, and property deeds that no one outside of his own preparation would ever notice, the invisible scaffolding supporting the life he had built behind the scenes. The sense of anticipation grew steadily, a quiet pulse in his chest that aligned with the rhythm of the room, the controlled masculinity of his composure a stark contrast to the overt energy of those around him. Every gesture from Emily, every sideways glance from Chad, every subtle shift in posture provided him with information about how they perceived him and the assumptions they had made. He thought back to long evenings in his study, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating spreadsheets, contracts, and statements, each entry a building block of security and leverage that would soon become evident to all. The realization of his own preparedness, the culmination of years of patience and diligence, filled him with a quiet, internal satisfaction that had nothing to do with the applause or attention of the room. He adjusted his cufflinks, feeling the smooth metal under his fingers, and let his gaze drift over the guests, noting the contrasts between performance and reality, perception and truth. Each smile and laugh from Emily's audience reinforced the upcoming revelation, heightening the tension and sharpening the edge of anticipation. Mark's awareness expanded to the smallest details, the weight of a hand on a shoulder, the subtle inflection in a voice, the spacing between steps on the polished floor, all pieces of a narrative only he could fully read. Memories of ordinary mornings with Emily surfaced briefly, the quiet breakfast, the laughter over spilled coffee, the walk through the neighborhood, but they now seemed like faint echoes compared to the intensity of the present observation. Mark breathed slowly, deliberately, aligning his thoughts with the pulse of the room, the ebb and flow of social interaction forming a landscape he had mastered silently. He sensed the moment approaching when the hidden would no longer be invisible, when the foundation he had built would emerge from behind the curtain of expectation, transforming the perception of everyone present, a silent but undeniable shift in understanding and acknowledgement of what had always been there, patiently, quietly prepared. By the time dinner service began, the room had settled into its most dangerous version of comfort. People were no longer watching themselves as carefully. Jackets loosened, voices rose, and the polite masks softened just enough for truth to slip through the seams. Mark stood near the long windows overlooking downtown Denver, the lights below scattered like coins across black velvet. He could hear Emily behind him, laughing with a small circle that had formed around Chad, her voice bright and confident, the kind of sound that used to make him turn with affection and now made something inside him go still. Chad was talking about a ski house in Aspen, making sure everyone heard the word Aspen as if it were a credential. Someone asked Mark where he and Emily usually vacationed, and before he could answer, Emily smiled over the rim of her glass and said, "Mark prefers practical places. You know, the kind with free parking and continental breakfast." The circle laughed, not because it was funny, but because they had been given permission. Mark felt the sentence land quietly. No explosion, no visible wound, just a clean mark inside the chest where respect should have been. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for one brief second he saw the woman from 12 years earlier standing in a tiny apartment kitchen in Boulder, barefoot on cracked linoleum, wearing his old college sweatshirt, smiling because he had brought home takeout after a 14-hour day. Back then, she had believed in slow beginnings. She had kissed him on the cheek while he balanced grocery bags and told him they did not need much as long as they were building together. That memory passed through him like warm light under a closed door. Then the present returned. Crystal glasses, designer heels, Chad's hand resting too comfortably on the back of her chair, Emily's eyes measuring the room to see who approved of her. Mark set his glass on the windowsill and said nothing. Silence had become his language over the years, not because he was weak, but because he had learned that careless people reveal more when they think you are harmless. And Emily had spent years mistaking his restraint for emptiness. She never asked about the late calls from New York, or the quarterly envelopes from the private bank in Connecticut, or why his old college roommate sent holiday cards on paper thick enough to feel like a contract. She had stopped noticing the parts of him that did not fit the small story she preferred. To her, he was dependable, modest, useful, and easy to underestimate. That was the box she had placed him in, and tonight she was decorating it in front of strangers. Across the room, a server passed with small plates of prime rib and roasted vegetables, the smell rich and familiar, but Mark barely noticed. His attention had narrowed to the phone in his pocket, silent against his leg. At 7:45, a message would arrive from his attorney confirming what had taken months to arrange. Not revenge, not a stunt, just timing. Clean, legal, and final. The charitable foundation he had built in his mother's name was about to announce its newest acquisition of a regional investment firm, a transaction that would place Mark's private holdings in the public eye for the first time in years. No one in that ballroom knew. Emily did not know. Chad certainly did not know. And the man standing by the window, the one they thought was saving coupons and choosing budget hotels, was quietly waiting for the moment when the entire room would learn that the smallest voice at the table had always owned the deepest silence. At 7:38, Mark felt the room begin to tilt toward the moment without anyone else knowing it. Emily was still laughing near the center table, one hand lifted as she told another polished story about their marriage, trimming away every inconvenient truth until only the version that flattered her remained. She made him sound small in careful ways, never cruel enough for anyone to object, but sharp enough for everyone to understand the invitation. Mark was the dependable husband, the practical man, the one who checked tire pressure before road trips and remembered to schedule furnace inspections before the first Colorado snow. In her story, those things were dull. In his life, those things were love. That was the part she had forgotten. He watched Chad lean closer, his expensive watch flashing under the chandelier, and heard him say, "Some guys are just built for the background." The words landed softly, almost casually, and that made them worse. Mark looked down at his hands. Clean nails, plain wedding band, no designer watch, no need to announce anything. He had spent half his life learning that real weight rarely makes noise. His first serious investment had been made from a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Boulder, with $2,800 saved from overtime, weekend consulting, and skipping every luxury Emily now used to measure a man. He had not inherited comfort. He had built options. Quietly, carefully. One rental duplex became three. Three became a commercial lot outside Fort Collins. A software stake he took instead of cash during a consulting project became the kind of number people whisper about after checking it twice. Later came private funds, land, partnerships, and the foundation named after his mother, a school librarian who wore the same winter coat for 16 years so her son could finish college without debt. Nobody in that room knew her name. Nobody knew that every major decision Mark made carried her voice in it. Be steady. Be useful. Do not confuse applause with value. Emily used to admire that steadiness. Then somewhere between promotion dinners, luxury magazines, and Chad Wilson's orbit of polished ambition, she began treating it like a flaw. Mark's phone buzzed once in his pocket. He did not reach for it immediately. He let 3 full seconds pass, feeling the vibration fade against his leg like a quiet knock from the future. Across the room, Emily caught his eye and lifted her brows as if asking why he was still standing alone. It was not concern. It was management. He knew the difference now. He slipped the phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. One message from Caldwell, his attorney. Final confirmation received. Public release scheduled for 7:45. Mark read it once, then again, not because he doubted it, but because he wanted to feel the clean shape of certainty. Around him, the ballroom kept breathing. Forks tapped plates. Ice shifted in glasses. Someone laughed too loudly near the bar. The ordinary world continued right up to the edge of impact. Emily walked toward him then, smooth and smiling, Chad trailing a step behind her like a man arriving to witness his own importance. "Mark," she said brightly, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Do not disappear on me now. We were just talking about ambition." Her smile widened. "Maybe you could learn something." Mark locked his phone, placed it face down on the windowsill, and looked at her with the calm of a man who had finally reached the last page of a long, difficult chapter. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe tonight is when everyone does." Mark let the anticipation settle in, a steady pulse behind the calm exterior, as he watched Emily converse with the group, her attention fully engaged, her smile practiced but genuine in its reach, the kind of smile that commanded admiration from anyone who did not know the hidden layers beneath. The gentle hum of background conversation, the soft clinking of glasses, the occasional laughter that rose like measured notes from a piano all contributed to the rhythm of the evening. Yet Mark existed in a separate plane of awareness, fully attuned to the unfolding social landscape and every subtle cue it provided. He remembered the countless hours of preparation, the evenings spent reviewing legal documents, the early mornings ensuring investments were secure, the meticulous tracking of accounts and assets that no one, not even Emily, had noticed, a quiet accumulation of power and stability hidden beneath the ordinary life everyone assumed he led. His gaze swept across the room, noting the positions of the guests, the way shadows fell on the polished floors, the tilt of a head, the slight hesitation in a laugh, every gesture a piece of a complex puzzle only he could solve. Emily moved closer, leaning toward Chad to recount a recent trip, and Mark felt the familiar tightening of awareness, the kind that sharpens perception without disturbing the calm of outward demeanor. He thought back to the foundation of his wealth, each step deliberate and methodical. The duplex acquired on a modest salary, the small commercial lot outside Fort Collins, the strategic partnership that had been overlooked by everyone else, the private investment in a regional technology firm that would soon make its public debut. These were not accidents, not strokes of luck, but the result of years of discipline and foresight, quietly accumulating strength while the world saw only a man of ordinary habits. A server passed nearby, the tray balanced with precise care, and Mark noticed the subtle reflection of the chandelier on the silverware, a reminder of the precision he had learned to value, the patience to wait for the exact moment when timing, opportunity, and visibility would align. His phone vibrated once in his pocket, a small, inconspicuous signal, confirming that the planned disclosure was set and the impact would be immediate. Mark did not move to check it. He allowed the vibration to pass, sensing the crescendo approaching in its own time. Emily laughed again, drawing the attention of everyone in her orbit, and he noted the contrast between her performative confidence and the quiet authority he carried, the kind that required no sound, no applause, only acknowledgement when revealed. He straightened subtly, the navy blazer smoothing over a broad chest, shoulders back, chin level, a physical manifestation of the patience that had defined him, the quiet power of preparedness manifesting without declaration. He allowed himself a small, controlled smile, a signal to himself that the moment of revelation was nearly here, that the careful accumulation of years, the deliberate choices, the hidden assets and influence, would soon emerge from the shadows to reorder perception and command attention. And in that moment, standing amid the laughter and the polite chatter, Mark understood that silence, patience, and foresight were the most powerful tools he had ever wielded. At 7:45, the first phone lit up near the bar. Then another. Then three more across the room, small rectangles of white light appearing like windows opening in the dark. Mark did not look at his own phone. He watched the room instead, because the first true sign of change is never the announcement itself. It is the silence that follows when people realize the world has moved without asking their permission. A young associate from Chad's table glanced down at his screen, frowned, then straightened in his chair. Someone whispered, "Wait, is that him?" Another voice answered, lower this time, "That is Mark Thompson." Emily was still smiling when the shift reached her. She had been mid-sentence, telling a story about how Mark once spent 20 minutes comparing gas prices on a road trip through Utah, turning thrift into comedy for people who never understood discipline. Her sentence faded before it finished. The laughter around her thinned, then disappeared. Chad looked annoyed first, the way men look when attention leaves them without notice. He pulled out his phone with one hand, still wearing that lazy half-smile, but Mark watched it drain from his face line by line as he read the news release. The Thompson Family Foundation, long considered a private philanthropic vehicle, had finalized its majority acquisition of Ridgewell Capital, a Denver-based investment firm managing several $billion in assets. The article named Mark as founder, principal benefactor, and controlling stakeholder. It mentioned private real estate holdings across Colorado, Texas, and Arizona. It mentioned early investments in medical software, logistics technology, and commercial land development. It mentioned a figure that made the air itself feel heavier. Emily blinked once, slowly, as if the words on Chad's screen had been written in a language she almost understood. "That cannot be right," she said, but her voice had lost its shine. Chad did not answer. His thumb moved quickly, searching, confirming, hoping for a mistake that was not there. Around them, people began looking at Mark differently, and that was the part that made the moment so quiet. Not loud shock, not dramatic gasps, just recalculation. The same men who had smirked minutes earlier adjusted their posture. The same women who had laughed at Emily's little jokes looked from her to Mark with the careful expressions people wear when they realize they may have applauded the wrong performance. Mark stayed by the window, one hand resting lightly on the sill, the city lights behind him steady and indifferent. He had imagined this moment many times, but imagination had always made it louder. In reality, it was almost peaceful. A room full of people simply ran out of assumptions. Emily took one step toward him, her eyes moving across his face as if searching for the husband she thought she knew, the useful man, the modest man, the man she could reduce to a punchline and still expect to drive her home. "Mark," she said, softer now, "why did you never tell me?" That question should have hurt. Years ago it would have, but by then it sounded less like heartbreak and more like accounting. Mark looked at her wedding ring, then at Chad's frozen expression, then back at the woman who had mistaken privacy for failure. "I did tell you who I was," he said calmly. "You just stopped listening when it was not wrapped in something expensive." The words landed without force, but the room felt them. Emily's mouth parted, then closed again. For the first time all night, she had no audience to rescue her, no laughter to carry her, no easy joke to place between herself and the truth. Mark picked up his phone from the windowsill, slipped it into his pocket, and felt the clean weight of a life that no longer needed to be defended. The silence after Mark spoke did not break all at once. It spread slowly, moving from face to face like a cold draft under a closed door. Emily stood in the middle of the ballroom with her polished smile gone. The woman who had been performing for an audience suddenly trapped inside a truth she had not rehearsed. Chad looked down at his phone again, then at Mark, then away toward the bar, as if distance could restore the confidence he had lost. Mark noticed everything, not with bitterness, but with the strange calm that comes when a long storm finally passes over the house and leaves only dripping gutters behind. Someone from the executive table cleared his throat and stepped forward, a man who had barely acknowledged Mark earlier. "Mr. Thompson," he said carefully, "I had no idea Ridgewell was connected to your foundation." Mark nodded once, polite but distant. Most people did not. That was all he gave him. No speech. No victory lap. The room wanted explanation now because wealth had made his quietness interesting, but Mark understood the trap in that, too. The same people who dismissed humility yesterday would call it mystery tonight, and he was too tired to sell them a new version of himself. Emily stepped closer, her voice lowered so the room could not easily feed on it. "You let me look foolish," she whispered. Mark looked at her gently, and that gentleness seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. "No," he said, "I let you speak." Her eyes flickered, and for a moment he saw panic behind the makeup, not because she had been embarrassed, but because she finally understood that every careless joke had been her own signature on the truth. She had not been tricked. She had been revealed. The difference mattered. He remembered the early years again, the apartment in Boulder, the cheap folding table they used as a dining table, the way she used to run her fingers across his spreadsheets and ask what dream they were chasing next. She had not always been cruel. That was what made the loss harder to name. People like to believe love fails in one dramatic moment, but sometimes it fades receipt by receipt, dinner by dinner, laugh by laugh, until one person becomes an accessory in the other person's performance. Mark had been disappearing from his own marriage for years. Tonight, he had simply stopped helping. Emily swallowed and glanced toward Chad, but Chad was still studying the floor, suddenly fascinated by the pattern in the carpet. That told Mark everything he needed to know about the kind of admiration she had chosen. It had weight only when the room was clapping. It vanished the second silence asked for character. Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out his car keys. The small sound of metal in his hand felt louder than it should have. "I am going home," he said. Emily blinked. "Our home." He paused. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just long enough for the words to become honest. "The house is still there. I am not sure the marriage is." Her face tightened, and this time no one laughed. Mark turned from the window and walked through the ballroom at an even pace, past the flowers, past the crystal glasses, past the people who had needed a headline to recognize a man standing in front of them. Outside, the Denver night was cool, the air clean against his face. The valet hurried to bring his truck around. The same dark Ford Emily used to joke was too ordinary for the events she wanted to attend. Mark smiled faintly when he saw it. Ordinary had carried him through every season that mattered. He climbed in, closed the door, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, watching his breath settle, watching the city lights stretch ahead like a road he had not chosen until now. Then he drove away, not fast, not angry, just steady, leaving behind the ballroom, the laughter, the performance, and the woman who finally understood that the man she mocked had never been small. He had simply been quiet. Mark drove through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting off the windshield in elongated streaks, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to think without strategy, without anticipation. The cool Denver air flowed through the open window, carrying the faint smell of pine and distant snow, and he felt the weight of years lift slightly from his shoulders. Each block passed calmly under the tires, each stoplight a reminder that the night belonged entirely to him now, that no one's perception could define the man he had always been. He remembered the moments of preparation, the spreadsheets and ledgers meticulously balanced, the legal documents reviewed line by line, the investments managed and recorded with the patience of decades, all hidden behind the ordinary rhythms of his life so that he could move with precision when the time came. In his rearview mirror, he glimpsed the empty streets and thought about Emily, standing in the ballroom, realizing at last that the version of him she had mocked was a mask for the man she could never underestimate. The quiet authority of that understanding traveled faster than any announcement, seeping into her awareness even before the official recognition of his holdings, his foundation, his careful stewardship of wealth and influence. Mark felt a moment of satisfaction, not prideful or loud, but steady and firm, as if the weight of truth was enough to balance the room without needing to speak it. He thought of Chad and the subtle recalibration that must be taking place, the reevaluation of assumptions, the sudden acknowledgement that the man they had underestimated could command the attention and respect of a room without raising his voice. The Ford hummed steadily beneath him, the tires rolling over asphalt that shimmered faintly from street lamps, and he allowed himself to reflect on the contrast between effort and performance, preparation and showmanship, patience and haste. He remembered the small victories hidden in months of diligent work, the quiet assurance that came from knowing the numbers, the accounts, the properties, the partnerships that gave him leverage without spectacle. For years, Emily had assumed ignorance where there had been calculation, underestimation where there had been power, and the irony was not lost on him. Mark felt a sense of release in that recognition, a release that was measured and unspoken, powerful not because it could be seen, but because it had always existed. He turned onto a familiar side street, the houses and trees passing in orderly silence, and thought about the home he had built not just for himself, but for the vision of what life could be, for the reality behind appearances. The radio played softly in the background, classical strings that seemed to echo the rhythm of his heartbeat, steady, controlled, unbroken. He thought about the first time he had realized that control could be the most effective statement, the quiet accumulation of advantage that no one could contest once revealed. The Ford approached the driveway, the lights illuminating the familiar facade of the house, and Mark felt the fullness of the night settling in, the calm certainty that he had navigated every challenge, every misjudgment, every misperception to arrive here intact and fully aware. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, appreciating the silence that surrounded him, the cool night air carrying a sense of finality. The home, the street, the world outside all waited patiently while he opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and felt the solid weight of presence, of authority, and of the quiet triumph that had been patiently accumulated, invisible until now. Mark stepped inside the house, the familiar warmth immediately contrasting with the cool night outside, the soft hum of the furnace and the faint scent of polished wood wrapping around him like a quiet reassurance. He set his keys on the counter and ran a hand along the smooth surface, feeling the texture of the countertop beneath his fingers, each detail a reminder of the careful attention he had invested over the years. The living room was empty, the soft glow from the lamps casting long shadows across the furniture, and he allowed himself to pause, taking in the space that had witnessed countless evenings of planning, reflection, and growth. His eyes lingered on the bookshelf, each volume deliberately placed, some old, some new, representing the accumulation of knowledge and effort that had quietly shaped his trajectory. The leather chair in the corner, worn just enough to be comfortable without appearing neglected, seemed to welcome him back, a silent companion in the quiet hours of contemplation. Mark moved toward it and sat, the chair conforming to his form as he exhaled, a long, controlled breath, steadying himself for the reflection that always followed such moments. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance, and he imagined the ballroom still, the reactions, the recalibration of perceptions that his presence had set in motion. Emily's expression, Chad's reevaluation, the subtle shift in the room, all of it played like a muted film in his mind, each detail precise, each reaction catalogued. He thought of the years spent quietly accumulating leverage and influence, not for show, but for the assurance of stability, the kind that does not depend on applause or validation. The foundation, the real estate, the investments, all converged into this quiet moment where preparation met patience and observation met action. Mark let his thoughts drift briefly to the life they had shared, the small moments of connection that had once defined the ordinary, the laughter over simple dinners, the late nights discussing dreams that had seemed too distant to reach. He acknowledged the contrast between then and now without judgment, understanding that the person he had been patient with in silence had misread his intentions and underestimated his foresight. The sound of a clock ticking in the background was almost rhythmic, marking not just the passage of time, but the presence of deliberate control, the steady cadence of a life managed carefully and thoughtfully. Mark stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street, seeing his reflection overlaid on the city beyond, a man who had moved through life unnoticed and unchallenged in the ways that mattered, now recognized, now defined by what he had silently built. He returned to the living room, picked up a glass of water, and sipped slowly, appreciating the clarity that came from knowing the work, the patience, and the decisions had brought him to this place, a place of quiet triumph, measured presence, and the undeniable awareness that the night had shifted entirely in his favor without a single shout, without spectacle, and entirely on the terms he had set for himself. The house stayed quiet for almost 20 minutes before Emily's car appeared at the curb, headlights sweeping across the front windows like a question arriving too late. Mark watched from the living room without moving. He had expected her to come home angry or frightened, or full of explanations polished in the mirror during the drive back from downtown Denver. Instead, when the front door opened, she entered slowly, as if the rooms themselves had changed ownership while she was gone. Her heels clicked once on the hardwood, then stopped. She saw Mark standing near the fireplace, his jacket folded neatly over one arm, his tie loosened, his face calm in a way she had never learned how to read. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The furnace hummed. The clock on the wall marked the seconds with steady little taps. Emily looked around the living room, at the framed photos, the bookshelves, the soft lamps, the ordinary objects of a marriage she had treated like background scenery. "How much of it is true?" she asked. Mark almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because even now she started with the number. Not the years, not the trust, not the way she had laughed while strangers helped her make him smaller. The number. He set his jacket on the back of a chair. "Enough that your friends stopped laughing," he said. Her face tightened. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, searching for the old rhythm where she spoke sharply and he softened to keep peace in the house. But that rhythm was gone. Something had ended between the ballroom and the driveway. She looked toward the kitchen, then back at him. "You should have told me." Mark nodded slowly. "I told you about my work. You called it boring. I told you about the foundation. You said charity was what people did when they wanted attention. I told you I had meetings. You asked if they could wait until after your dinner reservations." Emily blinked, and the color in her face shifted. The truth did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like receipts laid one by one on a table. Mark walked to the mantel and picked up an old photograph from their first apartment, the two of them standing beside a used couch they had carried up 3 flights of stairs in Boulder. Emily in the photo was laughing, hair messy, eyes bright, hands wrapped around his arm like the future was something they could lift together. He held it for a second, then placed it back carefully. "I did not hide my life from you," he said. "You stopped being curious." That one reached her. Her eyes lowered, and the silence between them filled with every small dismissal she could no longer deny. The cheap jokes, the dinner interruptions, the way she introduced him as practical when she meant unimpressive, the way she let Chad's comments sit in the air because correcting them would have cost her applause. "Mark," she said, softer now, "I made a mistake tonight." He looked at her, and for the first time that evening, sadness rose higher than satisfaction. "No," he said gently. "Tonight was not the mistake. Tonight was the microphone." Emily's lips parted, but no answer came. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, tires whispering over cold pavement. Mark reached for the folder Caldwell had delivered earlier that week, the one resting on the side table in plain sight, invisible only because Emily had never looked closely at anything that did not flatter her. He did not hand it to her. Not yet. He only rested his palm on top of it and felt the quiet finality of paper under his hand. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we are going to talk like adults. About the house. About the accounts that actually belong to this marriage. About what comes next." Emily stared at the folder as if it had a pulse. "Are you leaving me?" she whispered. Mark took a slow breath. He had asked himself that question for months in different forms, during late drives, silent breakfasts, and nights when she slept beside him like a guest. Now the answer no longer felt dramatic. It felt simple. "I am leaving the version of us where respect only matters after a headline," he said. The words settled into the room, calm and irreversible, and Emily finally understood that the fortune had shocked everyone, but the real loss was not money. It was the man who had stopped waiting to be valued. Morning arrived without drama, pale and cold over the rooftops of the quiet Denver neighborhood. Mark had slept in the guest room for the first time in his own house, not because he was trying to punish Emily, but because peace needed a door of its own. At 7:15, he came downstairs in jeans and a gray sweater, made coffee, and opened the blinds while the first light stretched across the hardwood floor. Emily was already at the kitchen table, eyes tired, both hands wrapped around a mug she had not touched. The folder sat between them. It looked ordinary, tan paper, clean edges, a simple thing to hold the end of a complicated season. Mark sat across from her and spoke without anger. Caldwell would handle the legal steps. The house would be evaluated fairly. The shared accounts would be divided according to the agreement they had both signed years earlier and forgotten in different ways. His foundation, private holdings, and premarital assets were protected, not as a weapon, but because his mother had taught him never to confuse love with carelessness. Emily listened in silence. Once, she tried to apologize, and Mark let her finish. She said she had been embarrassed by his simplicity, afraid that her circle would see her as less successful because her husband did not perform wealth the way Chad did. She admitted that the jokes had started small, then became easy, then became part of who she was around people whose approval meant too much. Mark heard her. He did not interrupt. Forgiveness, he realized, did not always mean returning to the place where the hurt happened. Sometimes it meant walking away without carrying the need to explain the wound forever. By noon, Emily had packed a suitcase and gone to stay with her sister in Aurora. She paused at the front door, looking back at the living room, the photographs, the staircase, the life she had treated as guaranteed. "I did love you," she said, voice thin but honest. Mark nodded. "I know," he said. "But love without respect becomes a room neither person can breathe in." She left quietly. There was no slammed door, no final speech, no audience to witness it. Just the soft click of a latch and the long silence afterward. In the weeks that followed, the world became loud around Mark. Articles called him private, brilliant, mysterious. People who had ignored him sent messages full of warm punctuation and sudden admiration. Chad disappeared from Emily's circle as quickly as he had entered it, proving that some men only stand tall under rented lights. Mark answered almost none of them. He returned to work, to the foundation, to the school library grants his mother would have loved, to the small, steady routines that had built him long before anyone cared to look. On the first Friday of spring, he drove his dark Ford west into the mountains, past pine trees and open sky, until the city fell behind him. He stopped at an overlook where the air smelled clean and sharp, stepped out, and watched sunlight move across the peaks like gold poured slowly over stone. For years, he had believed that being understood by the person he loved was the prize. Now he knew something quieter and stronger. A man does not become valuable when others finally notice him. He becomes free when he no longer needs the wrong people to notice at all. Mark stood there with both hands in his jacket pockets, the wind cool against his face, and felt no need to prove, explain, or perform. The fortune had been hidden for years, but the real treasure was never the money. It was the dignity he had kept when laughter tried to take it, the patience he had practiced when pride wanted noise, and the steady truth that he had never been small. He had only been waiting for the right moment to stop standing in the shadow of someone else's opinion.